super excited to host Casey again. Thanks for coming down from the city to do this. He's a teacher at Reforge. He's a growth expert and advisor. I'm sure you've read his, he's got, great posts on growth and product on his blog. You've probably seen his talks already. He was a formerly chief product officer at Eventbrite. He worked with Grubhub, Pinterest, some of the biggest, fastest growing brands and companies that are out there. He was also an advisor at Greylock. And he's got a really interesting talk today about, a lot of people focus on how to build your first product and how to succeed with your first product. Well, after you finish your first product, then you have to do your second product. And so he has a lot of great ideas and advice to share on when and how to build second product. So with that, please join me in welcoming Casey Winters.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. How's it going? I don't have a book to sell you today. I just have a bunch of random thoughts from a lot of pain, trying to keep startups growing for the long term, which a lot of time means you have to figure out how to build a second product that will help you grow. So Dan talked a bit about my background. I like helping companies scale. So, in terms of an operator at Grubhub, at Pinterest working on growth, at Eventbrite as chief product officer, but also did a lot of work on the advisory side, try to help companies figure out how they can scale for the long term. Some are on like the consumer side, like a Robinhood or, Reddit, some more marketplace, like Airbnb, whatnot, and then some B2B, like Vermont or Faire more recently. So we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about the types of product expansion that you should think about. We're going to talk about when do you feel like you should need to be thinking about a second product, what influences the timing of that, because there's a lot of different factors. Then it's how do you know if that product is working is actually a key question companies struggle with. And then how do you kind of set up a team to work on the second product? How do you figure out the process? And what are kind of some failure modes you might want to be paying attention to? So that's what we're going to talk about. I usually always like to start with product market fit for like any topics that I'm going to talk about product wise. So how do I define product market fit? A lot of people are like, oh, it's when you're like exceeding customer expectations and people love you. And I'm like, when does that ever happen in my career? Customer expectations are really hard to meet. Right? So they have this theoretical line that's always going up and to the right. That's really hard to stay in line with. Customer expectations go up every day. So I don't think product market fit's really when customers feel perfectly satisfied. It's when they feel satisfied enough to stop leaving and they start complaining about all the other things that you should have instead of just stopping to use the product. So one way to think about this, right, is product market fit also has a positive slope. Maybe not at the same level of customer expectations in aggregate going up all the time, especially on the internet. But if you find product market fit, which I would say is you have people who are finding value in their product, and enough of them are finding value in your product that you can scalably find more of them. So you can not only retain the people you have, but you can use that retention, whether it's in the form of them paying you money or them creating great content to go find the next set of users. But when you find that, you need to continue improving your product market fit, because if you don't, this line keeps going up, your line flattens, eventually you'll fall out of product market fit over time. And I'm sure you've all have used products that have had that. So when you found product market fit, most of the time you've done this as a founder, like you're working on, you just by iterating a lot. You build a lot of stuff, you see what works, you have some sort of high level vision, but you're trying a bunch of things to see what resonates with the market. So you're iterating a ton on what that core value prop actually is. And how you actually deliver it and make people understand it. But when you get above this line, you kind of unlock product market fit. You're not going to stop working on the product, but the portfolio of what you work on in product management, product development is going to change quite a bit. So one of the things we teach in the product strategy program at Reforge is that there's actually 4 types of product work. And roughly we'll talk about them as features, which I think most people have cut their teeth on. In terms of, product development, which is like, okay, I have product market fit and I'm making improvements to that core product value over time to make it stronger, make sure I stay above the product market fit line. Then there's growth, which is more where my background is, which is about connecting more people to the product value you've already created. You're not actually building a new feature. You're just trying to make sure you can get more people to be using the feature you've already built, reducing friction that prevents them from understanding or achieving the value of it. Then there's the scaling work, which is I now need to be able to support this product's value to more and more people over time, to more and more engineers, designers, and PMs and analysts inside the building so that they can continue to build new stuff, without being drowned by tech debt and stuck. And then what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today is expansion, When do I need to move into new segments, into new markets, or entirely new value props? So when you find product market fit, this portfolio of work opens up to you where you're no longer trying to unlock this new product value for the first time. You're like, I've unlocked it, and now I need to probably spend some of my time on improving it, just like the feature work, and a lot of my time on growing the number of people that use this thing, and then over time a little bit more scaling work. But what you don't really spend a lot of time on post-product market fit is expansion, because there's so much room for the product you found product market fit in to find the audience it should theoretically work for. But of course, that will end over time. Okay. One of the reasons that will end over time is that you can rarely ride one product into the IPO sunset anymore. I think we've talked about it, and I think what VCs historically have searched for in our industry are these single product massive wins, right? There's obviously a lot of big names, Google and search, Zoom and video, Duolingo and language learning, right? Where the market's incredibly large, right? There's low or very stagnant competition. In the case of this, most of the competition was offline companies, not online companies. Those markets are also growing really quickly. There's some sort of scarce talent pool that you have a considerable amount of that other people can't easily replicate, whether it's in video technology, right? Or machine learning, engineering. You have great economies of scale. And look, there's you can find examples of this in every, decade of our industry. But what you see more of now is to get to IPO, you need to have a multi-product strategy and you need to have multiple products that are working, right? And why is that case? Well, now if you unlock something and you don't move to international fairly quickly, someone's just going to build it for other countries before you get there. When you raise funding and you're attacking a market, chances are there's 5 other entrepreneurs that are attacking very similar thing. How many competitors do you have?
5 in YC.
5 in YC right now. It's only going to get worse.
100 other than I just told 5 in YC.
Just 5 in YC right now. It's crazy. Also the incumbents you're dealing with, the ones that are not in YC, the Medallias of the world, the product board, whatever, they're not asleep at the wheel anymore, right? They are tech native companies. They're not offline companies. They've read Clayton Christensen. They know the word disruption means, right? So they're paying attention to what you're doing. And if what you're doing starts to work, they'll just copy it very quickly, right? There is more talent also emerging to be able to do this in multiple companies, right? Like when Zoom IPO, there really wasn't anyone that could do really quality, video like that. Now, Google Meet's pretty good, right? There's startups that are pretty good, right? There's a lot more people that know how to do video engineering because the demand was there. And I think what we've also seen, and problematic for me personally, is network effects are no longer impenetrable, right? Grubhub built an amazing cross-site network effect between restaurants and diners. DoorDash spent $4 billion to destroy that network effect, and guess what? They did. So, just because you have network effects doesn't mean you're going to win forever, right? Still the best form of defensibility, but it's not impenetrable. You're not invincible just because you have network effects anymore. Okay. So if you're bought into the concept of I need to be thinking about a new product eventually, if I'm at a startup or if I'm at a larger company, then what are the types of expansion you need to be thinking about? So this is roughly ordered in degree of difficulty. So I think what we're pretty good at, especially in consumer businesses and marketplaces, is thinking about geographic and category expansion, right? So that's really understanding the playbook that got you to product market fit in your initial market or your initial city that you launched in, and then saying, how do I really break down what caused me to get there and replicate that in all these other markets, and really just change as little of the product as possible in the process, right? So what you see here, the attributes of these different types of expansions is my product changing? Is the market I'm targeting changing? And are the core competencies I need to unlock the value changing? These are basically the 3 attributes you'll find. And for geo and category, you're I'm not really changing the product. I'm targeting it at a slightly different area and hoping it just kind of works, right? And in the case of, Pinterest when we launched Brazil, or Grubhub when we launched Los Angeles, which are both geo expansions, that's basically what happened. Basically didn't really touch the product at all. And for categories, I worked, with Whatnot, which is a marketplace for collectibles. They launched in Funko Pops. How many of you know what that means? Dan's a geek. But, that's not a market that you can build a multi-billion-dollar company in. So they've expanded into sneakers and sports cards and women's fashion, a bunch of other things. Thumbtack's another company I've worked with, and they expanded into many categories as well. And that's generally your chances of finding product market fit there are a lot higher than some of the other things we're talking about. Format is a form of expansion where you are trying to tune your product market fit to a totally different type of device, thing like that. So you really only see this when there's massive platform shifts, like Netflix needing to switch to streaming. Snap is a recent example where they've tried to make things work on sunglasses and things like that. And Meta is doing this as well, where the product and the market maybe are the same, but you're trying to do it using a totally new core competency. Meta had to learn hardware. They had to buy a company, multiple companies, to sort of build that skill. What we're going to spend most of our time on today is what we call product value expansion. So I have a new product that I'm trying to sell to the market that I've already acquired with some other product value prop that they like me for. And hopefully I'm leveraging the same skills inside the company to deliver that. So that's HubSpot expanding from marketing into sales, or Uber expanding from transportation into food delivery are examples of that. And then, if you want to play in hard mode, the last two are platforms. So let's say you have an incredibly horizontal user base. A lot of times the additional value props that you can help them with are myriad. But take the case of a Shopify or a Salesforce. You just cannot build all of that stuff yourself. The roadmap starts to seem insurmountable. So what you do is you get enough scale that can allow developers to build some of those solutions on top of you, which strengthens both the retention, the monetization of your core product, but it also is enabling other people to build great businesses. Shopify, Salesforce, WordPress are all great examples of this over time. So your core product is the same. But your market sorts of shift of, well, I'm still selling to my existing market, but I'm also kind of selling to developers. And that's kind of the new market, which is why that's mixed. And you're having to build a new core competency of like, how do I expose my APIs? How do I create billing systems for people who don't work for me? Things like that. Well, and then last and certainly the hardest is strategic diversification, where your product and your market start to feel different, but you're leveraging some existing core competency to help them get there. This is Amazon Web Services, like, hey, we have the largest e-com infrastructure in the world. It turns out a lot of people would get benefit out of leveraging our infrastructure. Or more recently, Square launching a consumer business called Cash App, leveraging all of their financial expertise, but instead of targeting small businesses, targeting consumers. Okay, so if you're bought in that hey, I'm going to need to invest in new products over time, a key question is when. So what you're really trying to understand are the S curves of growth of your original product, and modeling how that growth is going to work so that you can predict when it's going to start to slow down, right? When that initial S curve is going to start to asymptote, right? And if you're able to model this effectively, usually what you're going to find initially is that there's constraints to your growth, but you can kind of optimize your way out of it. You can reduce friction. You can add in a feature here that's, people are getting confused about, things like that. And you can just kind of continue growing your initial product. But eventually, even with all the optimization in the world, with all the great features in the world, you will stop growing unless you can layer new product development on top in some way. Or a totally new kind of growth loop on your existing product. And the problem with that is new products take a while to find product fit. So you're going to need to predict when the growth is going to slow, and you're going to need to invest in the new product well ahead of that. So by the time the growth actually slows, your new product can start to pick up the slack, right? If you wait until you stop growing, start investing in your new product, probably going to be 1 to 3 years if you find product market fit before that thing can kind of pick up the slack. And as someone who's gone through that experience as a public company, I don't recommend it to any of you. Okay. So how do you do this modeling that we're talking about if you really want to get serious about modeling your S curves? Well, I recommend building a growth model. So when I joined Eventbrite, this is what I did. I built the growth model of how they currently grown, and realized that optimization wasn't going to save me. So this is the original growth loop that got Eventbrite to product market fit. So how this works is an event creator comes to the platform and they create an event listing. Then they go do a bunch of their own marketing to make people aware of that event and bring them to Eventbrite to transact. And if they're successful at doing that, the creator is going to sell tickets. People are going to attend the events. And then what Eventbrite found is that a lot of those people in attendance of those events were event creators themselves, and they would come back later and use Eventbrite to launch their own events. And then when creators are successful at selling tickets, this arrow at the top brings them right back to creating a new event. If your event is successful, you're going to launch more of it. So Eventbrite finds this, and this is working. The company's growing successfully. And instead of launching a bunch of new products, they basically were like, hey, how can we get this core growth loop to turn faster? So basically what happened is they started grafting a bunch of new acquisition-focused loops to the edges of this growth loop to create a more complicated growth model. This might look a little bit complicated, but it's actually quite simple, which is when the company makes money, which is when creators sell paid tickets, it started to reinvest that into other things that could acquire creators. Sales, paid acquisition, content marketing. And that's bringing in more creators than this core loop would do on its own. And then anytime a new event was created, Eventbrite started to distribute it on its own outside of, the event creator doing their own marketing. So, distributing it to Google, which is like, SEO, right? Distributing it to partner sites once it got larger, in integration with Facebook events, in integration with Spotify, and then distributing to existing users. Hey, you bought this event, you might like these other events, sending through emails and push notifications. So this creates a much more complicated model, but it's still really optimized about how do we get more creators, how do we posting more events, and then when they post an event, how do we make sure they sell as many tickets as possible, right? And the challenge when, I came in and modeled this is I realized while there was certainly fine tuning to do in all of these steps, none of the fine tuning was going to help us achieve our goals as a public company. We fundamentally needed to monetize better. And the core, event creation flow monetized at sub 10%. And you just didn't really have the opportunity to grow that number a lot unless you're going to create more value, which meant probably new products. So if, you're like me, and you come in and you find I need to build new products, we probably should have built them 3 years ago. The best time to get started is, today. The second best time was 3 years ago. If you're not as far along and you're trying to, not get kind of caught feeling like, I should have been dedicating a lot more time in my roadmap to this second product a lot earlier, then what are the things you can look for to try to figure that out? So if you talk to people historically about this problem, mostly they tell you based on your business model what you need to do, right? So if you're a consumer business, you're generally trying to build network effects. Network effects can scale to billions of users, so don't get distracted. Take your core consumer product, scale it via network effects, to billions of users. Any new product's probably just going to distract you, right? But if you're in B2B, you're going to find product market fit with a new product, and you're going to quickly want to launch a suite of products. Why do you want to launch a suite of products? Well, first off, you don't have network effects helping you grow. Two, the people you're going to compete with are largely going to be incumbents that do have a suite. If that suite doesn't have the product value prop that you have, they're going to add it. And even though it's going to work worse than yours, the combination of all of the other features might mean it makes it a lot harder for you to grow. So you need to build that suite, much more quickly, right? The other thing that matters for B2B is a lot of times you're growing via sales or a very delayed payback with PLG, where you're acquiring the user, and then there's this trickle down effect where eventually you get to someone with money at the company, who buys for a bunch of seats. So your acquisition, retention, and monetization potential of the first product in B2B is usually not that awesome because sales is never that cheap. PLG has a very delayed payback period. So a lot of times launching that second product gets you a lot of leverage on this growth work you're already doing, right? It dramatically increases your, either your net dollar retention or, the monthly fee you're able to charge for a business or a user, right? It makes the product more sticky. It's defensible, things like that. Some other things that matter in terms of when you need to build a second product is what's the size of the first market you're targeting and what's the growth rate of it, right? So we're going to talk about some examples today. But if you're Shopify and you launch a product for the e-commerce market, which is growing, sustainably over a 20-year period, right? Then maybe you don't need to, expand into a different product. But there's a lot of markets that might be small initially, and you're just going to run out of revenue opportunity if you don't expand. And lastly, which we'll give a bunch of examples, is how natural are the product adjacencies, for your market? B2B tends to be a little bit easier to find the next thing you can sell an existing customer. Consumer new product development is typically way more difficult, way more of a roll of the device. We have not found a way to dramatically de-risk consumer the way we have in B2B. So all of these matter, but I would say if you really get good at these other bullet points, business model is a total red herring. It does not explain at all when you should think about your second product. You need to be analyzing more of these components of your individual business and your individual market. And I'm going to show a bunch of examples of that. All right, so let's start with an example in the consumer space. So I joined Pinterest at the end of 2013, and we had launched around the same time as Snapchat. So these were two companies that were paired pretty closely because they're in the same space, growing at the same time in a time where, not a lot of new social content networks were scaling at this rate. So on paper, these look like very similar businesses, and we definitely paid a lot of attention to what Snap was doing, right? And were influenced by that. But when you start to break down these components, you start to see how even in this same sphere, a lot of these two businesses look very different. So first, on the competition side, there really wasn't anyone competing with us at the time at Pinterest to find a way that can connect you to more content related to your interests. Obviously, in the years since, there have been more entrants to that space, but really we're competing with Google, even though Google didn't really quite do that. So there wasn't really a lot of competition. People would even struggle to explain what space Pinterest was even in, because there was no one else even playing remotely close to our space. Whereas Snap was in more the classic tried and true, consumer social space of connecting with your friends, sharing videos. Instagram, famously kind of went hard in the paint to try to compete with Snap and try to head off their growth, especially internationally. So we'd say competition level feels very different for these two companies. When you look at the acquisition potential, Pinterest grew quite unconventionally, I would say, for a consumer social product, largely on top of Google, organic search. Snap more traditionally growing via virality, right? You would think virality would have higher acquisition potential. They usually grow a bit faster, on virality versus SEO. So that's why I have that medium versus high. Retention potential. So Pinterest started to build what we call a data network effect business, which is you come in, we figure out what stuff you like. Every time you engage with the product, we get a better and better point of view on what you care about, and we recommend better and better content. Every time you use the product to add infinite, right? Snapple is a more traditional social graph product. So you connect with friends, and there's kind of a Goldilocks zone of the right amount of friends. And then if you get actually more friends, it doesn't really help you engage any more often. It might actually decrease engagement because you're getting overwhelmed. So not as great retention potential, and you definitely see this in the activation rates between the two products. The monetization potential, I would say, is the smoking gun on this slide for the differences around the business. So Pinterest, which is a feed of content related for your interest, is basically a dream product to monetize the two primary ways consumer products monetize, which is ads and transactions, right? If we know what you care about, if we know what you're interested in, then we can tell advertisers that they can put ads right next to the content you're seeing organically. It starts to play very naturally. And then if there's a buy button next to it, great. Disappearing photos doesn't really create a lot of amazing ad inventory options. It creates more of a virtual currency or consumer subscription sort of option, which historically has not reached, as massive a revenue stream as ads-based businesses. So monetization potential look like a challenge for Snap. Both are in extremely large markets, extremely growing markets. While Pinterest had expansion opportunities around obviously other countries and making Pinterest work for different interests, which would be different form of category, Snap obviously had the format change options like we talked about with the glasses and some more natural product innovation than I think Pinterest would have. So, okay, you start to see these differences between the business when you look under the surface. Let's look at how they actually handled their second product launches. So first off, you have to look at, does the core product evolve, right? And what you can see with Pinterest is that the core product, how it thought about acquisition and retention, both changed dramatically post-product market fit. First, how Pinterest acquire users. Originally, it was growing on top of the Facebook Open Graph API. Facebook turned that off one day. Pinterest stopped growing. They came to me and they were like, Casey, is there this SEO thing we can use to replace this Facebook traffic? And the answer was yes. So I started working on that. We're able to kind of pivot to Google as a growth lever instead of Facebook. That worked out quite successfully. And also on the retention side, we were originally growing based off of connecting with your friends and seeing what your friends were saving as well. And while this worked really great for Midwestern moms, as we kind of expanded into the cities, into other countries, there started to be more heterogeneity related to interest. If you're connecting because your significant other invited you, you don't want to necessarily see, all the stuff that she's saving. You have very different interests. So we moved away from a friend graph to a topic graph or an interest graph. And we asked you what content you were interested in. We started showing you the most popular stuff in that space. And then as you interacted with certain things, we would get better at recommending more. Snap's core product didn't really evolve at all. Instead, they spent much more time on their second product launch. So both companies actually launched their second product the same year. Pinterest launched Place Pins, which was like a map-based product for like saving cool restaurants, things like that. It did not find product market fit. It no longer exists. But Snapchat launched Snapchat Stories, which was a massive hit, and solved some of their monetization problems as well. Both companies tried to launch, a third product, right? Pinterest launched a Q&A product, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That also did not find product market fit. It is also not available today. And Snap launched Discover, and that also found product market fit. So you're like, okay, you see this one company kind of iterated on the core model, couldn't really make new product development work. You see this other company just seems to be nailing it on the core product development side. And then you get to the end of the slide and you're like, wait a minute, why the hell is this one worth more than this one? And you start to see that like, okay, well, like Pinterest had a product that from an acquisition, retention, and monetization perspective, everything works and you can just scale that to 1 billion users. And Pinterest is only halfway there. It's only got 500 million decks. It still has a lot of room to grow. And where you look at Snap and you're like, well, there was kind of no way they could make any money off the first product. They needed these second and third products to even have a chance of building a good ad-based product, which is the only proven way to scale, a consumer business model. So they're valued at about the same. Certainly seemed like Snapchat had a much harder road. So you can see just because you're a consumer product doesn't mean you don't necessarily need a second product to scale. Okay, let's look at PLG SaaS because no one works at consumer anymore because there aren't many consumer companies in like a decade. So these are both companies I had the pleasure of working with. Stigma, we led the Series A while I was at Greylock, and Canva, I was an advisor in 2017. And on paper, these feel like competitive products. They're not competitive at all. Stigma builds a design product for designers. Canva builds a design product for everyone else. So when you start to analyze these attributes, Figma on paper looks like it's in a very competitive space. There's existing incumbents in Sketch, which all the startups were using, and then Adobe as well. And no one had really built design products for non-designers before, Canva. Like theoretically, Photoshop is the competitor, but no one that wasn't a designer used Photoshop because it was too hard. So literally, the value prop was like it's Photoshop for the rest of us. So theoretically, competition for Canva was pretty low. Now on the acquisition side, both of them had what I would call a content loop, which is you create a piece of content and then you share it to other people inside your organization. But Figma would have a higher retention potential because it's used by product designers inside broader companies. There are generally multiple product designers inside most companies. Canva is used by a lot of small businesses, teachers, individuals, so that ability to share content and then get other people to pay because they're also going to create content was lower, which meant the monetization potential was also higher for Figma. You can charge a per seat model and you're going to get a lot of seats over time inside organizations. Medium for Canva, because while consumer subscription, SMB subscription can work, you're really going to get that one subscription. You're not going to really get 100 people at a company using Canva. VCs at the time thought the design market wasn't that large, so I put medium here. They were, of course, wrong in retrospect, but everyone did acknowledge that design was like a high growth market. And both of them on paper had similar adjacencies that they could expand into from a product perspective. And then as you look at how things evolved over time, Canva obviously launched a little bit earlier than Figma. They both had to do some evolution to how they acquired users. I think Figma is a little bit more natural, right? You're a product-led growth motion to, have individual designers try and reach the design community. And then, once a bunch of designers are using it inside their company, then you can kind of come top down in sales and sell the entire company. Canva's trying to make that work, but I wouldn't say that's really been a driver of its growth so far. But Canva was able to leverage some more consumer techniques to grow. SEO is the one in particular I helped them with. And now they're trying to make enterprise sales work. There's like a famous meme of at their conference around some of their enterprise launches recently. I don't know if you saw that. And then on the retention side, I think it's really interesting. Figma, back when I was working with them, basically thought it was a way for designers to collaborate. And now I think when you talk to Figma, you're like, it's a way for designers to collaborate not with each other. It's a way for designers to collaborate with all their cross-functional stakeholders, engineering, PM, et cetera. And that really helped drive growth of the company. For Canva, they started doing a bunch of things to kind of make you not have to start from scratch if you're not a designer. So they built a bunch of templates, they bought a bunch of stock photo marketplaces, so that you kind of had something you could always build on top of. When we look at their second products, you start to see a difference in how they grew. Figma launched a community product, kind of intention to be a Dribble competitor, didn't really work. Canva launched presentations. This did find product market fit. It's kind of a viable product that is scaling. And they both try it again with new product development. Figma's launched FigJam. Not exactly the Miro competitor or killer that they hoped it would be, but like it's getting out there. It might be there. It might have product market fit. We'll see. Canva launched a video product. That seems to be working. And then you start to see that, Figma tried to get acquired for $20 billion. The federal government had some things to say about that. So I put in their last, VC valuation, which was 10. But both these companies are doing quite well. I think the thing that's surprising here is you're like, wait a minute, I thought Figma was in the competitive space and Canva was in the non-competitive space. Why is Canva the one that has to make new product development work and Figma can still just be like continuing to grow when really it's all still coming from their core product? And I think what you see here is that while Figma originally was in a competitive space, the product market fit gap between them and the incumbents was so large and has not really closed over the last decade. So they went from a competitive landscape to a not competitive landscape over time, where it just feels like Figma owns the product design market entirely. Whereas Canva grew so quickly, attacking a market that no one thought there was any money in, that it started to become a threat to Adobe and Microsoft. So then Canva finds itself somewhat surprisingly in the position of, wait, if I don't build out a suite and Adobe launches, a Canva clone and Microsoft launches a Canva clone, before I even reach a lot of those customers, they're already going to be serviced by something 70% as good as what I have. So they've gone aggressively in trying to build out the suite to try to make sure that they can defend against these very large incumbents who are somewhat surprisingly, have their sniper rifles pointed at them instead of Figma, which you might have predicted. So I think what this means is when you're looking at these attributes, right, of competition, how well you're able to acquire, retain, monetize, growth in the markets, adjacencies, you have to be looking at these variables regularly. You can't just look at them when you start the company and assume it's going to be the same 10 years later, right? Maybe every 6 months, every year, and you'd be saying like, does this still feel right? Does this still feel like the right way to evaluate our market, and our strategy? Because in these two companies, it became dramatically different as they scaled. Okay, marketplaces, which is, my personal favorite business model. So I'm going to use Grubhub and Instacart as examples here. So with marketplaces, as you scale, you kind of collect all of the acquisition loops. So you might start with something like SEO on the demand side and sales on the supply side, but eventually you're going to do everything. You're going to do all the paid stuff. You're going to do all the TV. You're going to do all the, incentivized referrals because you have significant, LTV that you're accumulating. And marketplaces, if you're able to get them to work, which is hard to do, but once you're able to get them to work, they tend to retain really well because they have cross-site network effects where the more suppliers you bring in brings in more demand. The more you demand makes it easier to acquire, suppliers over time and keep them because suppliers are just going to go where the sales are. So both of these have really great retentive products. Both of them on paper can generate revenue really well, but Instacart's problem was it really couldn't have that turn into profits very well. Because while Grubhub, maybe some consider a little bit of an old school marketplace at this point, basically all it's doing is connecting buyers and sellers and facilitating payments. The restaurants, you deliver your own food, right? Like that's how it worked for the first decade. Instacart is like, we need to have someone go pick the items. We need to have someone go deliver the items. And there aren't that many grocery stores, so they're not willing to pay us for the incremental demand we're getting compared to, hundreds of thousands of small restaurants. So they really couldn't, at their core product, build a lot of profit into the model. But grocery was a larger market than food delivery, I'd say still is today, though the gaps are closing. They all have the same adjacencies, which is like you want to expand, across cities and countries. And maybe there's some product expansion. So when you look at the product expansion though, both of them evolve their acquisition the way we talked about. Cross-site network effects still is kind of what wins the game from a retention perspective. Grubhub launched their second product while I was there, Pickup. And not only did it not find product market fit, it actually cannibalized our first product because you're starting to pull non-delivery restaurants into the search results to try to get them more exposure. It's confusing customers who are coming to the site mostly to, order food to have it come to you. And so it starts to kind of mess with your network effect on the demand side. So when we launched Pickup, not only did it not find product market fit, it really slowed our growth for a little bit until we figured out how to like ratchet it back. And that partially explains why Postmates was able to deliver a foothold in LA. Is that we kind of were growing really quickly in LA, and then Pickup had the most negative impact in that market. We were too late to diagnose it. Instacart really built its second product to attack this core fundamental issue in their ability to create good unit economics, which is they added a Faire side to the marketplace. Wouldn't necessarily recommend this. This is really talking about playing on hard mode when you have 4 different customers. But they basically said, hey, the way groceries actually monetize is their core business model sucks too. But what they do is they add something called slotting fees, where they get these CPG providers to pay for better real estate inside the store, and that's how they can eke out additional profit. So Instacart launched Instacart Ads in 2019 to basically create a digital slotting fee, which is when you're searching for some item, some CPG company can pay to show up ahead of their competitors, and this is what allowed them to kind of start to eke out profits. This has worked quite well for them. It's where I think the majority of their revenue is coming from now, and certainly, all of the profit. But then you look at this and you're like, well, Instacart built a 4-sided marketplace. They had to build this ad exchange on top of the core marketplace, and they're valued the same amount as Grubhub after all of that work. It's just a lot harder, but there's no way you would have a successful grocery marketplace IPO if they didn't do this. So on paper, these are marketplaces, but in reality, when you dig underneath, these businesses can operate more differently, even though they're the same business. Okay, last one that we're going to go through today, consumer subscription. So are there any Duolingo or Calm users? And okay, got a couple. So consumer subscription, typically not a great space. Like you don't have network effects like consumer social products. You don't have high, LTVs or net dollar retention like you do in B2B SaaS. But still, we have some pretty successful winners over time. In the case of Duolingo and Calm, Duolingo language learning, lots of players in that space. Historically, will be lots of players in that space. Calm, there was a bigger competitor called Headspace that had already kind of scaled. Lots of people have come in since on the meditation side. I think one of the big differences when you look at consumer social is most consumer social companies are going to grow by buying Facebook ads, which is exactly what Calm mostly did. Duolingo was actually able to grow more organically and more viral on social. Consumer subscription has always been really difficult to retain customers. Consumers are irrational. They don't have as much money as businesses. So you don't have net dollar retention. So the people that stay don't pay you more money over time. They pay you the same, monthly subscription rate or annual subscription rate. And mostly these companies are making 90% of their money on subscriptions. Duolingo's making like 10% of revenue on ads from people that don't pay them. So they have a freemium model. But really, it's all about subscription. Language learning, bigger market than certainly meditation was. And some differences in how to think about adjacencies for these two products as well. So these companies also launched at a similar time and evolved how they grew their core products over time. So Duolingo did layer in some paid acquisition effectively over time. Calm actually expanded into sales and referrals and a bunch of partnership models. They kind of were following more of the marketplace playbook. We got to get in as many things as possible to grow. Duolingo started to have more of a network effect product over time, where it felt like every time someone did a lesson, it helped make each of their lessons better for every incremental user. And then they layered in gamification to try to, keep more people going. Streaks is like a huge driver of their retention. Calm started on the web, which I don't think most people know about, but it's actually a pretty kick-ass web product. But they launched mobile, that fueled their growth. And they started trying to create these hacks for daily engagement, like the daily Calm and push notifications. Okay, so they also tried to launch their second products around the same time. Duolingo launched Tiny Cards. It did not work. It's no longer around. Calm launched Sleep Stories, and this worked big time because meditation, is a smaller market. Sleep is everyone, right? Everyone needs to sleep. A lot of people are struggling with sleep. So this created a lot of product value. It expanded their market and increased their retention rate because when you're bundling meditation and Calm and sleep, and they both have product market fit, you're going to keep people much longer. And then they started launching Calm as a mental health benefit to businesses as their third product. And that is also found product market fit. But then you look at this and you're like, okay, well, Calm's now got a couple additional products that are working and they're worth maybe a quarter of Duolingo if we're generous, right? This is like a last VC valuation. I don't know what this would be if they raise more capital, but it'll probably be even lower, right? Because Duolingo is just a much larger market and their acquisition costs are a lot cheaper. And it turns out that's pretty much what matters in consumer subscription. Calm did nothing wrong, but what they didn't find is a way to very, very cheaply grow in comparison to Duolingo. So, okay, I think there's a few things when you do all these comparisons across business models that you see, which is these different companies that are theoretically in the same space need to think about new value props at very different times in their life cycle. A lot of these companies have never figured out new product development, and it doesn't matter because they end up being in very large markets, right? Most of us are not fortunate enough to be in that scenario. We're in these markets that are, sizable but not infinite. We're going to need new products to work. I think what you also see in all of these examples is that new products are less likely to work when they're just kind of like a random bet on innovation. New products work when they have to work, when it's the only way you can continue to grow, when the CEO is like really invested, right? Which is not, I think, what most product leaders teach today, but I think it's wrong. So if that's not the case, what tends to happen with new product development is it will distract from core product development where you have a lot of growth headroom. It won't get the focus and time it needs to develop because new products take like over a year to work generally. And it's going to feel like if you're putting the resources there, it's because it's some CEO pet project instead of the most efficient use of resources compared to the core product, which might have competitive pressure, and you're nowhere near, extracting the complete value of the TAM. So that's one thing you see. What you also see in these companies that have made their second product work or their third product work is they were not using portfolio theory, right? So if you like go Google like how to think about innovative product development, you're probably going to hear like, oh, I put a certain percentage in innovation, I put a certain percentage in growth, I put a certain innovation in features, and I just have this portfolio mix and it creates scalable growth. And I think that's like a relic of the past. I don't think that's how you're going to see the next generation of companies continue to grow. I think people are going to get better at understanding their growth model, forecasting the growth that they have in their initial product, and when they predict that they're going to start to see asymptotes on that growth, they're going to bet big on some new thing that probably attacks the biggest weakness in their growth model, whether it's the retention side or the acquisition side or the ability to monetize. And you're not going to see lots of simultaneous new bets from early growing companies on new product development. Sure, if you're massive, right? If you're, a FANG level company, you're of course going to have simultaneous new bets. Those bets are going to need to be like $1 trillion TAMs, but you're probably going to have massive bets. But if you're a Series C startup, 3 years ago, they probably had like 5-6 different innovation teams working. They definitely don't have that anymore. Okay. Other thing that I think to pay attention to from this example is you probably noticed a trend where on the left side of the table, you had a company that basically didn't need a second product to become a public business. And then on the right, you saw someone that needed a second and maybe even a third. I don't think you're going to see that many companies that look like the companies on the left over the next 10 years. Most companies are going to be grinding it out like the companies on the right side of these tables have, for lots of reasons we talked about. Their markets aren't going to be as large. Their markets are going to be more competitive, right? But they're also being very strategic about how they bet on that second product. It's attacking the weakest point in the business, right? And they're really digging into all of these elements of their business to understand when they need to do it, how much they need to bet, and are they betting in the right place, right? So more conviction, more figuring out exactly where the bullseye is and when to kind of fire the arrow. Okay, so switching gears, if you're working on a new product, how do you know if it's actually successful inside a company? And, as Dan mentioned earlier, we have pretty great frameworks for understanding this for brand new products, right? We have the concept of product market fit. And, my version of product market fit is that you're trying to build a product that creates core product value. And that core product value basically needs to pay for your ability to acquire new users scalably. So if you have a retention cohort curve like this, you have a bunch of people that keep using it. That means it flattens out, many months into the future. And that group of users represents either some money, that you're making that you can reinvest into acquiring more users over time, which is the orange bar chart, or they're creating content that you can distribute, over social, virally, or through Google. It brings people Basically there's 4 ways to scalably grow, right? Sales, it's paid acquisition, it's virality, or it's content sharing, right? The problem with second products is product market fit is not the appropriate framework to think about. Because product market fit is basically saying, hey, this product needs to kind of fend for itself to figure out how to retain users and monetize them and use those 2 elements to kind of find more of them, right? But for new products, you really don't need them to do all of that. You have a core product that might be handling acquisition, it might be handling monetization, and you've launched the second product to make it easier to acquire customers or to monetize them better. So instead of needing acquisition, retention, and monetization to work for the second product, you may only need it to work with one of them. So on paper, you're like, wait, so it should be way easier to launch a second product than a first product, right? I think it's just like yes and no, because while you really only need one of these 3 to work, when it works, it has to work big enough so that eventually it can help power growth at the company-wide level, right? So what you see a lot happen is an innovation team will build a product, it will find product market fit, but it will be in a lower TAM market. It won't monetize as well. And you graph this thing out in your growth model 5 years down the line, and even with healthy growth, you're like, this just doesn't move the needle for my overall revenue growth, like ever. Like, why are we working on this, right? And this is a big problem at the Metas of the world, or the Googles of the world. If they need something that's going to grow Google as a company by 2028, with the amount of revenue that Google has today, it's got to be big. It's got to eventually be very big. And so this is a thing that a lot of teams miss. Okay, so when you're setting up your new product development team that's going to be attacking this new product opportunity, I think one thing to remember is that unless people at teams have founded a company before, which sure some of you have, but most people inside companies haven't, they're generally not going to be very good at understanding how to do product development. First off, they weren't hired for that. If they were hired at a startup post-product market fit, they were hired to scale the product market fit of that company in some way by building features, by building good infrastructure, or by being good at growth, right? So they're not going to have the intuition or feel that the founders generally have had around what product market fit feels like and how to start 0 to 1. So this is a big problem. So if a founder's just outsourcing to a bunch of PMs, that were there once the company was already 100 people and, had thousands of customers, they're generally not going to be good at navigating the second product problem. So I recommend founders do not outsource this. One of the founders has to be involved. They need to be there. They need to be making sure they're instructing the team on like what that feels like, hopefully learning the right lessons from when they got the original product market fit. A lot of founders didn't learn the right lessons. I will make that caveat, but I try to not work with those founders. Secondly, as we mentioned, regardless of their involvement, they need to be incentivizing big enough swings so that when it works, it matters, right? If it works and it's never going to impact the company's own growth, it was a waste of time. And ideally, those swings are attacking what you've already identified as the weak point in your growth model, whether it's the ability to monetize or customer acquisition costs are high, things like that. Okay. How do you think about process for this sort of team? It is another challenge because most new product development doesn't work initially. It's going to take a year, sometimes 3 years. How long has Meta been working on VR? 10 years? Still not there, I would argue. It takes time, and the traditional OKR process measured in quarters or halves, it ain't going to play out. You're going to cancel these things before you're on the right track. So really the product development process for, trying to build a totally new product value prop is about building a learning feedback loop. So it's not about whether we're winning. It's going to be a long time before we're winning if we even get there. It's going to be, are we learning something that gets us closer to the pot of gold? And do we have a better understanding of what the shape and size of that pot of gold, looks like over time? So in thinking about progress, really good teams at this are saying like, look, I'm not going to have spiffy OKRs to say the number of MAUs, the number of revenue I'm going to have, but I am going to have, here's the list of assumptions. Here's the order in which I need to prove and disprove them. Here's the path on how I feel like I'm going to prove and disprove them, what I feel like I'm going to learn, and I'm going to bring that learning feedback loop back to the founding team, back to the executive team as soon as I have it. And even if they do all of that, there's a lot of failure from what you might see as like a chief product officer, out working on this or as a founder. So the first one that you see is just, it's the destination for where you've actually achieved product market fit, where you've got a new product that's working, it's just way further away than you thought. It's just going to require way more work. So this is what happened with that Q&A product while I was at Pinterest. We originally thought we could build something lightweight that says, okay, there's a pin, there's a person who saved that pin, anyone can ask that, owner of the pin a question. Oh, how does it fit? Like, does it run small or large? Right? Like, a bunch of other questions. And as we started building more and more, we just kept finding more and more we had to do to even have a chance of that thing working. So many moderation tools, so many filtering tools. So eventually the PM on this team, Michael Yarmtino, went back to the founders and said, we should shut this project down. I am no longer confident that with a reasonable amount of product development, we can build something that's going to be materially impacting the company over time. And we did. A second problem you have is that destination is just not the right destination, or like it's mythical. Like there's not ever going to be anything there. This happened while I was working with Tinder as a client. They had this concept of like, we're going to build this Tinder social product for friends instead of for, dates. And it sounds good in theory, but there just isn't a willingness to pay for that. There isn't really a willingness to use software for that. People in theory say they're interested in it. In practicality, they're not. So that product, got shut down. There's also this example where the teams will use kind of, some lean principles, and they'll just veer off track from the original destination we aligned on. And if we're saying second products need to be going after a destination that's big and really helps the growth model of the company overall at a time, a lot of times when you veer off track to a new destination, you'll find you're no longer really meaningfully helping the growth of the overall company, even if you're successful. So I had a company I worked with more recently, and travel company, low frequency, right? So one of the things in the growth model that we were attacking is to try to target locals instead of travelers, which would be high frequency, and build them a product that we can make subscription instead of transactional. And, the team comes back like a couple months later, and now they realize the product, which is like a package acceptance product, was targeting people that were in the United States for like less than 90 days that wanted to order a lot of packages they could bring back with them to their other countries. So they needed like a local address where they could pick up stuff. And we're like, wait a minute, these aren't locals. This isn't like a product that improves our retention. Like it has incredibly high churn, when you look 6 months out. Like, why are we doing this? Like, this no longer like attacks the weaknesses in our growth model at all. It's not something that we're possibly acquiring. So, we backed off of that project. And then the last is that all the team is learning is that everything they're doing is not working. So that learning feedback loop is broken. So they're like, the only thing they're coming back to you as a leader or a founder is saying like, well, this didn't work, but they're not like, because this didn't work, I learned X, and X is going to get me closer to the thing that will work, right? So if you're seeing that, you gotta cut ties. So seen all of these in my career, unfortunately, because it's a really hard problem. But that said, a bunch of people do build second products that work. It's an important endeavor. But I think you want to be keeping track of these, whether you're the PM on the team, whether you're the product leader, mapping, whether they're really going to build something that works or not. So if you care about some of these topics, this is kind of a sample of some things I worked on for Reforge on 3 different areas. One is all the growth model stuff is called the Advanced Growth Strategy Program. The different types of product work is the Product Strategy Program. So if you're interested in more of this stuff, we teach these cohorts multiple times a year. But with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Casey.
Yeah.
Great talk. I have a question real quick. So I love S curves, and you were saying, hey, well, when the team projects that their current S curve is going to flatten out, then we can start planning ahead right? Sounds good, but how do teams realistically know? I feel like it's more like reactive versus proactive that they realize that. So I'm just curious, how do teams project? Have you seen examples of teams doing a good job projecting that?
Basically, to take the Growth Hub example, right? So kind of build an understanding of how our cross-site network effect is working. And then I start to basically turn what I showed today as a qualitative model, which is like you map on a whiteboard how you think all the relationships work. You then turn that into Excel, right? Where you have all the conversion rates, you have all the inputs, all the filters. And in the case of Grubhub, that allowed us to say like, okay, well, here's how Los Angeles is trending. Here's how Chicago is trending. So if I want to hit my growth goals for the next year, I need to launch 8 new markets. I need to launch 20 new markets. I now know the population sizes of all those markets. I know how much search volume there is for each of these markets, right? Which is the primary way that we acquired demand. I know, and we had a decent understanding of how many restaurants did delivery in those markets. So we knew how much supply that we could acquire. And we generally knew, how much an individual salesperson could acquire. So you start modeling, an increasingly large number of rows spreadsheet as you understand what these filters are. And, we got pretty good at that. I remember, I think this was 2010, 2011, I built the growth model. We get to the end of the year and we're 99.3% to goal, because in reality, it's just like a super trackable business, a geographic marketplace. So once you have the back data, you can, reasonably forecast forward, right? That's not always the case. You might be dealing with much more of an unknown TAM. So then you're kind of relying on the individual teams to start building better intuition. So you're going to start somewhere. It's going to be wrong. You're going to revise your forecast and you'll just get better and better over time, which I work with a lot of my clients on today. So look, you're not going to be doing this at Series A, but at Series A, you're probably not thinking about when you need your second product. That's probably 3 to 5 years away, right? But more so when you're getting to be a middle to later stage startup or certainly a public company, you can have the resources in finance, analytics, and then a lot of times a growth leader, because a growth leader is going to need to go to their CEO and say, I can't optimize my way out of this one, boss. Like, I'm going to need some help, right? And which was certainly, a role that I've played multiple times.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just have a question. It seems like a lot of product strategy is identifying what the product work you need to do, depending on the competitive landscape and the stage of the company. How do you think about things such as the 7 powers in the context of your core product going through growth, or if you need to do PMF expansion with that new product and how that fits into there?
So are you thinking about it from the 7 powers from the customer level, or from the
just a
level?
Business kind of building a moat and considering this Hamilton Helmer's 7 powers?
Yeah. I would say I'm extremely biased on this one in that I'm really only concerned with one, which is network effects. That's the one I'm always looking for. So So obviously there are other things that are potential scalable moats, right? Like brand or economies of scale. That's just not the game that I play in my career, right? So I'm primarily focused on building cross-site network effects and then data network effects. I think what I've seen with other consumer companies that I've worked with or that I've been employed by is even if they're a direct network effect, which is, hey, every additional user makes it more powerful for the existing users. Cross-site network effect is there are generally 2 types of users, right? There's a supply side and a demand side, and the demand side, it's only more valuable if it gets more supply, and for demand and for supply, it only valuable for more demand. So each side when there's more of them. And then data network effects is anytime there's additional engagement, it helps both that user that's engaging get better value, but then people that look like that user, also get the value, right? So Pinterest is a data network effect. WhatsApp is a direct network effect. Every online marketplace is a cross-site network effect. So what I try to do is help juice network effects, and that's exclusively what I focus on. I recognize the value in some other moats, but it's just not really the particular skill set I have, from the product and growth side. So I can kind of say I recognize that's a good brand, but I'm not going to be the one that builds that for you. So that's just, I'm honed in on that one, but it's definitely not the only way to play the game.
Thanks.
Yep.
Casey, thanks for a really insightful presentation. I really like how you compared the business model and the factors. 2 related questions. One is, do you have any insights in the growth model of companies which have digital products versus companies that have something physical like Instacart or something like that? Is there any difference in adding a new product? Does that impact? And then related to that, do you have any insights related to how Amazon expanded from books into this next product line?
Yeah. So I'll tackle the second product first, which is, Amazon originally was a first-party, e-commerce provider, right? Not the best business model in the world, incredibly expensive, but it allowed them to, if they could sell something very boring like books online, it allowed them to kind of de-risk category expansion, which they did quite aggressively. But I think what really made the business survivable and got to good from a cash flow perspective was that they made it more marketplacey over time, where there were third-party sellers, which they monetized at a much better rate than, facilitating the sale themselves, right? And they've had hiccups here, right? So I think you see with a lot of marketplaces that they do category expansion is if they get too high level and this is kind of like the TAM and this is the thing, they might not recognize some of the differences in the product market fit required. So when Amazon expanded into fashion originally, it was pretty disastrous because like fit's a big problem, taste is a big problem, and like Amazon doesn't have taste, right? Like that's just not like who their brand is. Versus things that are a little bit more objective was where they were kind of winning. But those are the main things that like I understood. Obviously AWS was a lot later and created entirely new markets for them. And when you get that big, I think Amazon's been the best at understanding new product development as a skill inside a company, which is, okay, like here's the thesis I have. Here's the way to structure the team. Here's the way I evaluate the product market fit signals. And if I don't get them, I pull it at an appropriate level of time, but I give it the right amount of time, to develop, right? Whether that's Kindle or whether that's Alexa or whatever. Alexa, they spend way too much money on, in my opinion. But most of the time, they feel like out of the big companies, they have the most defined process, right? And I think some of that is like category expansion is a bit of a warm up to new product value prop, and they did more of that than other consumer companies. Your first part of the question was about like creating second products where the value is really delivered offline, and you're just a facilitator as the software, where the value itself is delivered, online. And I've had the pleasure of working with companies that do both. And one of the problems with the companies that deliver the value offline is you can kind of do everything right as the software provider, but if something goes wrong in the offline world, it'll be associated to your software, even though it's not your fault, right? So at Grubhub, right, the example is like food arrives late. They're going to blame you. So first off, you need to say like, do I have signal that something went wrong in the offline world, right? So at Airbnb, right, like I don't really know if the stay was good. So we try to get as many reviews as possible. We try to follow up on those when they don't work. And generally it's a dominant strategy for startups to just assume responsibility for the offline action, whether it's their fault or not. So if the restaurant served bad food or they delivered the food and it was late, we just took care of it at Grubhub because we valued the feedback. And if that restaurant kept doing it, we were going to kick them off. And we knew that users that had a negative experience with us when we made up for it had a higher lifetime value than people had a negative experience that had never had a negative experience. Now, that does not necessarily scale super well to being a public company, but from kind of Series A to IPO is pretty much a dominant strategy for marketplaces. So that's what most of them do. But a lot of times, like, I had that cohort slide somewhere. I'm not going to try to find it, right? But in that cohort analysis slide, you're basically trying to have like the y-axis is some action that indicates the user received value, and then the x-axis is over what time period, right? Could be daily, weekly, monthly, depending on the product and the natural frequency of it. But a lot of times, the ideal way to measure whether they receive value is something that the product doesn't even have measurement of. So you have to go find a way to invent measurement of it, right? Which is like survey-based, right? So at apartments.com, we charged on subscription because we couldn't really tell if the leads converted. So we just trusted that if we drove enough high quality leads, the apartment buildings would trust that. Our competitor, rent.com, they gave the person who was searching for the apartment a $250 Amazon gift card if they reported that the lease came through rent.com. So they went the opposite strategy and said, we're going to actually get the offline data that says we actually drove the tenant, and we're going to incentivize the demand side to give us that data so that we can more confidently sell a slightly different business model. In the end, apartments.com won out in that market and has become a much larger company, but I thought it was a really interesting kind of comparison. So a lot of times I'm working with we don't actually have the data if we did our job. How do we go get the data? Do we institute a survey? Do we institute a review, right? In the case of Grubhub, do we actually put software on the delivery driver's phone to see if they went and actually dropped the thing off, right? And that helps us, understand if there are issues with the part that we don't control, what do we do to fix it? Do we kick off the supplier? Do we kick off the driver? All of those kind of elements.
Hi, thanks again. Can you talk about starting a marketplace and the platform? You mentioned Shopify briefly.
Yeah.
And what are the early start problems they may have to face?
Yes. I just did a podcast. I just did 2 podcasts on this. So I can share them afterward, but I'll try to do a TLDR. So first off, what's the difference between a platform and a marketplace? They are both cross-site network effect businesses. The platform business model for the first, let's call it 5 or so years, looks identical to B2B SaaS, which is you have to build your own killer app. In the case of Shopify, like just good e-commerce software that processes transactions, etc. And then you get to enough scale where you can start to attract other developers to build on top of you if you have the right development infrastructure. There's a bunch of components, right? And most people, when they get large enough with their kind of core use case, like say a Slack or pretty much name any B2B company, they will start by launching integrations with other products their customers already use. So like at Eventbrite, we integrate with MailChimp because that's the most popular email provider, that our customers use, right? And that you kind of need to make sure you're finding product market fit with those integrations before you have a chance of someone building an entirely new business on top of you that wasn't possible before. And most platforms can't cross that chasm because they might not have enough customers. They might not have enough good distribution for new products if they are built to their customer base. Or there just might not be a lot of interesting new products to be built on top of you, right? So Eventbrite was launching a platform strategy when I joined. I said, we can't even service our internal developers well. What's the chances of us serving our external developers well? Shut it down. And so we're just going to focus on a couple of the key integrations that we know our customers want. And we made sure that those were in a good position because many of them weren't, when I joined. Doesn't mean platform strategy isn't necessarily a good strategy eventually for Eventbrite, but I just felt we were launching it too soon. We weren't ready. And I think what you've seen with some other platforms like Slack is they haven't really achieved that, here's a bunch of billion-dollar businesses that have been built on top of Slack. Shopify, WordPress, Microsoft, Salesforce all have billion-dollar businesses that have been built just on top of them, right? Klaviyo is a recent IPO where most of the customers, are Shopify customers and rely on that integration. So that's the platform side. So you're really just running at first the B2B SaaS playbook, but you're probably going to be running it in a more horizontal market where there's more homogenous needs at scale. You're not going to be able to service them all. Developers will come in and fill the gaps. Hopefully, if you build a lot of things right and you're very patient. Brandon Chu has a good video on this from Shopify, who led developer platform there. If you're interested in, maybe we can find a way to link that. I think it's public on YouTube somewhere. Okay. Marketplaces. So the challenge with marketplaces is you need to get the product right for two sides at the same time to unlock product market fit. And most of the time we don't even use that term in marketplaces. We call it liquidity. So we were trying to figure out is like, okay, generally the value prop on the demand side is like selection. I see a bunch of options related to a need I have. You're trying to figure out how much selection creates good conversion on the demand side, right? And then how do I get that conversion to turn into like a second order if it's a higher frequency thing like food delivery? Obviously, apartment rentals, you're not going to book another apartment the next week. And then on the supply side, generally it's, okay, I'm signing up all of the supply, and I might be doing that manually through sales, which is the most common in marketplaces. And then it's like, how much transaction volume do I need for them to decide it's worth it to stick around? And how much time are they going to give me to show it? Because if you launch a new market in a marketplace and you're selling the dream, right? Most of the SMBs or individuals, they know you're not going to necessarily like give it all up front. They're going to give you some time. So what we found at Grubhub is we had 4 months to prove it. And if we could get the restaurants to 2 orders a day within 4 months, they would never churn on their own. Now they might involuntary churn, which means they went out of business, which unfortunately happens a lot in restaurants. But if they were able to stick around as a business and we facilitated that with the incremental volume, they generally kind of wouldn't churn. So we ended up getting into a point, which happens with every marketplace I work with, where there's some sort of metric like 2 orders a day on the supply side that you need to get to, though it's custom every time. And there's some amount of supply you need to have a high enough conversion rate that can allow you to acquire customers scalably through like Google Ads or Facebook or, start to build an SEO presence. And that can build a good enough retention rate of people, in the case of Grubhub, people coming back and ordering a second time in the first month. So you figure out what those metrics are, and then, you're not going to nail them 100%, but at a high enough rate, let's say 40% of people on the supply side getting it, 40% retention on the demand side, that market will just start to scalably grow without you, right? Because the network effects have sort of kicked in. So that's the model. It tends to take about double the time of B2B SaaS. So out of the clients I've worked with, Thumbtack, I think, took the longest. It took 4 years to get to product market fit. Faire, I think, was the fastest, around 6 months. But generally it's a couple years minimum. It's a grind. And then when you get it, you have it in like one tiny market, like you still have basically no revenue. So you have to generally raise venture capital. And then you have to explain to investors that like, because I've unlocked it in this market, the playbook to unlock it in all these related markets is like now super easy and turnkey. And some people get that, some people don't.
Sorry, I just wanted to expand on that question. And so if you're expanding into a new geo, would you do something where you kind of like blitz it and just try to get as many people as possible? Or do you like subsidize restaurants and just do like fake orders or like sponsored orders to make sure they have those 2 orders a day? Like how do you make sure you hit those metrics?
I would say this line of thinking was possible in the zero interest rate environment, and then it's sort of fallen away. I think Reid Hoffman even wrote a book on it called Blitzscaling. Not so common anymore. So I think, for Grubhub, right, just practically we couldn't do any of that because we had raised a 1 million Series A and a 2 million Series B. Like we didn't have like all this money that marketplaces had raised in the next generation. So we were trying to grow very, very thoughtfully and very profitably. But in all cases, you're generally thinking about some way to subsidize one side to give you enough time to get the other side. And that may be, you just sign them up and they're going to be patient, right? So when I joined Grubhub, we were actually going demand first. We had scanned all the paper menus in a market, put them online, started ranking for food delivery terms on Google. People would come, browse the menus, and call the numbers. We changed the numbers to our numbers to be able to track how many conversions were actually happening. And then we went to the restaurants and said, like, once we actually built an online ordering product that worked, we went to them and said, hey, we're getting a bunch of demand. Do you want to show up ahead of your competitors and get online orders? And because delivery orders are super profitable, because they're already paying the rent anyway, they're already paying the labor anyway, and they can always pump more food out the kitchen. So whenever a restaurant can get an extra catering order or delivery order, they just take it kind of no matter what. They might complain about the fees, but like they think of it as it's extremely profitable to get those incremental orders. So that's what was happening when I joined. And then we hired a VP of sales, and we just really grinded away to make sales a lot more efficient, where it was pay for performance, cancel at any time, 1-page contract, no fancy language, like just 3rd grade English, like the simplest thing to understand. And we started closing restaurants just way easier. So then we're like, wait a minute, if we're signing up restaurants super easy, we can get to like 50 restaurants in a market before we launch. Then I, as like the head of the demand side, can then go take that aggregation of restaurants, create badass SEO landing pages just with them, and do some AdWords on top of it, and start getting all of them enough orders that they stick around within the 4-month time period. So we switched from being demand first to supply first to launch a market. Pretty much every marketplace at scale is demand first, because if you own the demand, supply is going to stick around because all they care about is more business. But whether you're supply first or demand first to unlock the market depends on some of these factors and what's easier to pull off. 9 out of 10 are going supply first today. Thumbtack was demand first. But Uber and Lyft, they basically just paid the drivers to sit idle, and then trusted that they would eventually book enough transactions to not have to pay them to sit idle. And that obviously worked out pretty well. And that was just a pure subsidy. We're basically paying you a fixed hourly rate. If you get bookings, you have to take them. If you don't get bookings, cool, you're getting paid regardless. And eventually every driver is getting a ton of bookings. In the case of Grubhub, we didn't have to book fake orders or anything, because they would give us 4 months, and within 4 months we could be ranking high on Google and making AdWords profitable on like a 6-month payback period basis, which was our target. But if we didn't, we might have had to either lengthen the payback period, which is iffy when you're an early stage startup because you really don't know what the LTV looks like, or just say, fuck it, we don't care, because we're making this investment. So there's a quick story about that that triggered my memory, which is I left Grubhub at the end of 2013. At this time, DoorDash was like a Series A company. Uber Eats hadn't even launched, the model that they ended up finding product market fit with. Postmates was a Series A company. But, I'm at Pinterest and I start, catching up with some of my colleagues from Grubhub a year later, and they're like, man, these Silicon Valley startups have raised all this capital now. they're spending so much money on AdWords. It's not sustainable. Like, we're trying to maintain like our 6-month payback periods, and we can't. We're going to have to raise our target to a year-long payback period just to keep up. And they're like, this doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, look, like, you don't understand. You're not even playing the same game. They're playing a liquidity game. They have drivers that they are paying whether they deliver orders or not. They have restaurants that they may or may not have signed up, or maybe they're like stealthily delivering the orders to. And if they don't show volume to those sides, they actually lose more money. So they're playing a liquidity game. They're playing a let's spend money to get to product market fit game, subsidization, right? And you're playing a scalable, efficient growth game, right? Where you know what the LTVs are, like you already have liquidity and you're trying to get incremental, more orders, more new users. So yeah, they're going to spend more than you, because unlocking a market like Chicago is worth what? $500 million to them over time, where it's not worth $500 million and you've already unlocked Chicago and you're trying to get, 10% additional growth. But one of the reasons they could do that is they raised a lot more capital than Grubhub did, when they were early stage. Part of the reason they were able to raise capital is because Grubhub IPO'd and proved to the venture capital community that there was a lot of money in food delivery.
So Grubhub was like 12 or 13 years back. Is SEO as an acquisition channel, is it still relevant? Is it still as important as it was before?
Okay, so it's ebbed and flowed, right? So Grubhub, I made SEO work in 2008. Apartments.com, it's 2005, and then Pinterest really made SEO work in 2014. And by the time I got to Eventbrite, SEO was already working pretty well, right? They had been at it for quite a few years. So the advice I would have given in the middle of the 2010s was like, look, SEO is not a great first acquisition loop for startups anymore. It takes too long to accumulate content. And, Google has this concept of like authority, right? Which is like, do we trust the source of this content? And the way they trust the source of this content is how many other people link to that content. Startups are not going to have as many links to them as incumbents, right? So that period of time was really hard to displace incumbents. Then Google started to change the model around authority to be much more topical in micro topics. So if you created great content in like a very tiny niche and you really understood like the entire graph of what that user asked questions about, instead of just optimize for that one keyword, you would beat, New York Times or whatever, right? And now it's yo-yoed a bit again, where there's AI content coming in. Google doesn't have a good way to handle it yet. So they're like, maybe I'll just rank Reddit for everything, because then at least I know it's from real users. So now Reddit's getting spammed. So it's really hard to predict if SEO can be a real scalable growth loop for a brand new startup coming out. In some cases, you're looking at like this 2x2, right? Which is there a lot of search volume, and how much competition is there for that search volume? And if there's a lot of search volume, but there's not a lot of competition, you could probably still win, but generally only see that with things that are trending really quickly, right? So I have an angel investment I made in a marketplace, and part of what they do is they teach pickleball lessons. Pickleball had basically no search volume 7 years ago. Now it's a lot, right? So there's like, we're going to right up at the top of that. We're going to get all of it. We're going to convert it, and they're growing incredibly fast. But they're not doing only pickleball. They do other stuff, golf, tennis, whatever, right? So sometimes you see that with new technologies, right? Like there's no one that's been optimizing for, RAGs for 15 years at SEO, right? Like no one searched that, until maybe like 2 years ago, right? So there's a lot of new terms like that where, maybe you're way ahead of the game of incumbents and you have the best content and you can still win. But it's getting trickier and trickier to rely on that, because it feels like you could do everything right and still lose. The algorithms are changing much more often than they used to. And there's going to be so many people coming in so many directions due to the AI content wave. So it's hard. It's not my favorite right now. But it still is like a lever. I'm not going to be like, not try it at all. But a lot of times I'm cautioning it for it being the only strategy you've got.
So you opened the door there by saying it's not your favorite. What are some of the other channels that you are finding people are having success with?
Yeah. So for marketplaces, SEO is still big. So I don't want to like diminish that, even for like Series A startups. And if you think about it from a venture investing perspective, paid is generally like the least favorite, because unless the network effects are working really well, you're going to acquire more and more marginal users with worse LTV over time. So it always just kind of looks worse. So it's really hard to raise new rounds if you're primarily growing through paid. So it's not paid. I think we've gotten just way more efficient at sales these days. So like I think sales is very durable, both for marketplaces, and for SaaS. I love me a good PLG story, but I'm also but also sales. Let's not pretend it's one or the other. It's going to be both. My favorite stuff is trying to figure out where can I distribute either content created by supply or content created by users in networks larger than the startup that aren't fully optimized, right? So for a while in a lot of spaces, it was Google. So that's where I focused. And now more recently, it's been TikTok or Instagram search. So I'm working with some startups that are basically SEO-ifying those networks because now they're large enough where in certain categories, not all categories, but in certain categories, they'll actually have enough search volume where you can grow like you would have done on Google 10 years ago. And it's completely untapped. Very few companies are doing it. Now you need to have the content that can penetrate those networks effectively. But a lot of times you can learn that skill. So I've been excited about a few different companies that are doing that. And it still feels very nascent as a growth loop. So that's probably where I'm most excited. I'll give you a couple names off stream. I don't want to blow their spot.
Thanks, Casey. It's very thought-provoking. I actually want to shift gears to more of the process piece that you talked about of how to do this. So let's say it's not a founder, but a large company product leader. What would the organization structure be to be able to pull this off? Do you need to advocate for a GM structure? And then how would you incentivize the people? I have my own battle scars from this, but the employees are being rewarded with the company stock. If you're part of a BU and doing something net new, how do you incentivize them? So question is both on the product, I guess the leader of the initiative, how do you empower them? And second is the people as part of the initiative, how will they get incentivized to be able to pull this off?
So I can tell you what I did in this scenario at Eventbrite. I acquired a company. I had someone on my direct team be responsible for that integration. I was the executive sponsor. And then I had one of my direct reports be in charge of the integration. And then the CEO of that company was in charge of the growth of that business as it integrated into our company and relaunched as a product on the path to product market fit. And then how much money they would make would be tied to ultimately the success of that product. At Tinder, Tinder was actually one of these incubations underneath the Match Group. It was not a startup. So what they did is they built an individual stock that was valued every 18 months inside of the Match Group through independent auditors, instead of just rewarding them with Match Group stock, because Match Group, obviously is not going to grow as fast as Tinder. And they felt that Tinder was important enough to do that because Tinder was the primary growth lever for the combined company, right? Match Group has a ton of mostly mature dating apps, and Tinder was the fast growing one. Now, the founders of Tinder and a lot of early employees actually sued Match Group over this separate independent stock, saying that it was undervalued. It was a whole hullabaloo. I don't know who's right in that argument or not, but that is a challenging thing because, it's kind of like who watches the Watchmen on how valuable the company is. One of the reasons people raise venture capital is kind of you're going out to the market and someone's saying this is worth X, right? When it's already completely owned by an independent company, you can't really have venture capitalists do that unless you're spinning it out, which sometimes you do. Like TripAdvisor spun out of Expedia, Qualtrics has been bought and spun out 3 times now. I don't know how they do it. So that happens. And then at the time you kind of get independent stock. So that's something that could make sense, but a lot of times doesn't. And then GM structure versus independent, right? So generally, if you're acquiring a company or if you're launching new, you're trying to basically keep something separate where it's the core business isn't going to fuck with it for a while. They can't fuck with it. So at Eventbrite, when we're trying to build out the consumer business, which didn't exist, we created a GM, separate engineers, separate product, etc., and ran it independently until it got far enough along to kind of absorb back into the core experience. I think whether you want a GM model or not is when you map the growth model, how independent does the growth model start to feel for that business as like, this business is just incremental revenue that largely isn't strengthening the core besides making the entire company more profitable, right? Versus the only reason it works is because it's closely grafted onto some core thing. And if it's closely grafted onto some core thing, which is most marketplace models, then you're unlikely to GM it long term. You're GMing it just until it kind of unlocks the thing it needs to unlock. Whereas if it's largely separate, like say Kindle, right? You just separate P&L, it gets its own separate goals, and you're not necessarily gonna, if you're Amazon, want an independent stock, because Amazon stock's been pretty valuable, but you're probably gonna have something like an LTIP, a long-term incentive plan, which is what we did at apartments.com for this, where there are certain milestones around growth, profitability, et cetera, that trigger bonuses of more Amazon stock in that case, or just more cash. And so again, not a finance expert on all the different models, but just some of the ones I've worked on or seen.
All right. Well, why don't we wrap there? Thanks everybody for the great questions. Thank Casey for a great talk.
Yeah, thank you all.
Sharing your wisdom. Awesome.